the evidence that refused to be silent when science confronts certainty. Disclaimer. The following analysis represents careful examination of publicly documented evidence, expert testimony, investigative records, and scientific findings. We are not making definitive claims about guilt or innocence, but rather exploring how physical evidence creates patterns that demand re-examination of long-held assumptions. Multiple interpretations remain possible. This examination focuses on documented contradictions between stated narratives and forensic realities, asking questions that the evidence itself compels us to ask. The enduring enigma surrounding JonBenét Ramsey's death is not simply about an unsolved case. It is a profound study in how assumptions once established can eclipse physical evidence and delay justice for decades. We've spent years walking these same corridors of investigation, reading these same reports, examining these same conclusions. But recently something shifted. Not because new evidence emerged, but because we finally paused long enough to notice what the old evidence had been whispering all along. What emerges when we strip away the layers of certainty is a pattern of gaps and inconsistencies that continually challenges the premise that shaped this investigation from its first hours. We approach this reflection guided by the factual record left behind in interrogations and reports, seeking to understand the psychological landscape of denial and certainty that complicated the search for truth. And at the heart of it all sits something so ordinary it's easy to overlook, a bowl of fruit that became the crack through which doubt finally entered a seemingly sealed narrative. The riddle of the pineapple, denying the undeniable truth. Theme 1. The certainty that created suspicion. We've circled this timeline for months, but the inclusion of the pineapple in the autopsy findings keeps resurfacing. Not because it's extraordinary in isolation, but because its conflict with the Ramsey's initial account immediately cast a pall of suspicion over the entire family, creating the foundation upon which an entire investigative theory would be built. There's something almost mesmerizing about the consistency with which John and Patsy described that final journey home. In his 1998 interview with Lou Smit, John recounted the moment with the kind of detail that speaks to a memory replayed countless times. He struggled slightly to lift JonBenét from the car. She was growing, getting heavier, but still his little girl. She was sound asleep, he said, or just out, describing a state of profound unconsciousness. He carried her upstairs, her body completely limp, her breathing deep and regular, showing no sign of awareness as he navigated the stairs. Patsy's description aligned perfectly. JonBenét was really zonked, she told investigators in her 1997 interview. The long Christmas day, the excitement, the presents, the party at the White's house had finally overwhelmed the 6-year-old's energy reserves. She had surrendered completely to exhaustion. When Patsy helped change her into night clothes, the child never stirred, never opened her eyes, never gave any indication of consciousness returning. The narrative was clear, consistent, emphatic. JonBenét ate nothing after arriving home. She went directly from car to bed, unconscious throughout, undisturbed until morning when she would be discovered missing. And then the autopsy spoke. Partially digested fruit or vegetable matter consistent with pineapple, present in JonBenét's small intestine. Not in her stomach where recently consumed food would remain, but further along in the digestive tract where it would travel during the natural process of digestion. The medical examiners working with established science calculated backward from the digestion state. The pineapple had been consumed within approximately 2 to 4 hours before the child's life ended. We pause here because we must let the weight of this contradiction settle. This isn't speculation or competing expert opinion. This is biology, as concrete and unarguable as fingerprints or DNA. The child's digestive system, which cannot be coached or influenced by narrative needs, tells us she consumed pineapple during the hours after the family returned home, during the precise window when both parents insist with absolute certainty she remained deeply, unreachably asleep. One of these certainties must be false. In his 1998 interview with Lou Smith, John Ramsey acknowledged the significance of this forensic fact. Smith pressed the point carefully. There is nothing that we can do to change that particular fact. The pineapple existed in JonBenét's digestive system. That was immutable truth. John's response deserves our careful attention. He admitted that stating they had fed her pineapple would have simply ended the discussion with police. The mystery would evaporate. The contradiction would resolve. Yet they didn't choose this easy resolution. They maintained the denial despite understanding, as John's own words confirm, that the denial itself created suspicion, transformed them from grieving victims into defensive subjects requiring explanation. This suggests something profound, that whatever truth the pineapple represented, acknowledging it was more dangerous than accepting the suspicion the denial generated. From a psychological perspective, we find ourselves examining not just what was said, but what the saying of it reveals. When confronted with physical evidence that contradicts your stated timeline, the natural human response is confusion, uncertainty, tentative revision. That's strange. Maybe she did wake up and we didn't hear her? Perhaps I'm misremembering when she fell asleep? Could she have gotten up without us knowing? But that's not what we see in the record. Instead, we see absolute denial, maintained across multiple interviews, sustained despite mounting evidence of its impossibility. Neither parent fed her. She didn't wake, she didn't eat. The pineapple couldn't have been consumed in their home during those hours because those hours were accounted for, sealed, certain. The physiological reality forces us to confront what digestion actually tells us. Food follows a predictable journey through the human body. Mouth to esophagus to stomach to small intestine. The rate varies based on factors like food composition and individual metabolism, but within known parameters. For pineapple to be found in JonBenét's small intestine at the time of her passing, consumption had to occur during the crucial window after arriving home. Someone fed this child, or she fed herself. During hours, her parents state with unwavering certainty she was unconscious and unfed. From a forensic criminology standpoint, this contradiction becomes the foundational crack. Everything the family's timeline rests upon, the belief that the household retired for the evening, that whatever occurred happened during hours of parental sleep and helplessness. That any perpetrator must have been external, operating during unsupervised darkness. All of it requires accepting that JonBenet remained asleep after arriving home. But the pineapple proves otherwise, and if this cornerstone claim is demonstrably false, what does that reveal about the structure built upon it? The philosophical question that emerges asks us to contemplate the psychology of maintained denial in the face of irrefutable contradiction. Why insist on something provably untrue when the evidence is literally written in biological processes that cannot lie? What purpose does this particular denial serve that makes it preferable to simply acknowledging an uncomfortable but relatively innocent truth? That the child was awake during hours initially thought to be sleep time. Perhaps the answer lies not in the pineapple itself, but in what acknowledging it would require acknowledging next. If JonBenet was awake and eating, what else was happening during those hours? Who else was awake? What activities occurred that aren't part of the timeline offered to investigators? What sequence of events would be exposed if this door were opened? The denial, we begin to suspect, protects something larger than simply being wrong about whether a child ate a snack. It guards a space in the timeline that cannot withstand examination. a period that must remain closed and certain precisely because uncertainty about it would unravel carefully constructed explanations for what came after. Theme 2. The scene that whispered different truths. The physical evidence related to the pineapple ingestion only deepens the puzzle, resisting logical explanation from either the internal or external perpetrator theories that have dominated discussion for nearly 3 decades. Let us walk slowly through what was actually documented, attending to the details that refuse to settle quietly into comfortable narratives. In the 1998 interview, Ramsey examined photographs of the pineapple scene. His observations are telling. The large spoon troubled him. He noted it appeared to be Patsy's good silver, an odd choice for what should have been a hurried, practical late-night snack. The bowl itself was substantial, far larger than necessary for a child's portion. Beside it sat a glass containing a tea bag, the string draped over the rim, suggesting someone had prepared a hot beverage to accompany the fruit. Patsy's response when shown these same photographs carries a different kind of significance. She stated she did not prepare the bowl, emphasizing that the size of the serving spoon was unsuitable, inappropriate for the task. Her reaction wasn't confusion or uncertainty, it was definitive rejection. This arrangement violated her domestic patterns, her sense of how things should be done in her kitchen. Yet forensic analysis would reveal that her fingerprints were on that bowl, alongside Burke's. Her hands had touched it, gripped it, handled it with enough pressure to leave identifiable ridge patterns. The physics of fingerprint deposition doesn't allow for ambiguity. Skin contacted surface, oils transferred, evidence was created. How does someone touch a bowl and have no awareness or acknowledgement of having done so? The answers narrow uncomfortably. Either memory is genuinely disrupted, through trauma, through protective editing, through the mind's desperate attempt to wall off knowledge too dangerous to consciously hold, or memory is intact, but the truth it contains cannot be spoken without destroying carefully maintained narratives about that night. Ramsey, confronted with the impossibility of reconciling the pineapple with the intruder theory, offered an explanation that deserves our attention. If JonBenét had been forced to eat by a stranger, he reasoned, she would have screamed bloody murder. The child wouldn't have complied silently with an unknown threatening figure. Therefore, if ingestion occurred as the evidence proved it did, it must have been served by someone she knew and trusted. This logic, while attempting to preserve the external perpetrator theory, actually reveals something else, an implicit acknowledgement that the pineapple moment was domestic, familiar, unthreatening. Someone the child trusted, someone she would eat with comfortably without fear, someone who knew where the pineapple was kept, where the bowls were stored, which utensils to select. From a psychological perspective, we observe how explanation shifts when evidence cannot be denied. The pineapple exists in the autopsy record that cannot be changed. So the explanation must evolve to accommodate this immutable fact, while still protecting the larger narrative structure. Enter the figure of someone familiar but external. Perhaps someone who played Santa Claus at their party. Someone with theoretical access and trust. Someone who could explain the domestic comfort of the scene while remaining outside the immediate family circle. Yet this explanation requires us to believe that an external actor, having gained access to the sleeping household, navigated to the kitchen, located pineapple in the refrigerator, selected serving items from cabinets and drawers, prepared tea for themselves, arranged everything on the kitchen table, sat with the child while she ate, and only then proceeded to the terrible acts that would follow. Each element compounds the scenario's improbability. Real criminals operating in enemy territory minimize time, risk, exposure. They don't pause for snacks and beverage preparation. The physiological evidence of the tea glass adds another layer. Tea is typically an adult choice, requiring hot water preparation, steeping time, specific implements. Its presence suggests adult participation in this moment. Someone comfortable enough to prepare themselves a beverage while a child ate pineapple at the same table. From an anthropological lens, we can examine what this domestic arrangement reveals about power dynamics and comfort levels. The kitchen table, not a counter or breakfast bar, suggests sitting down together, taking time, engaging in the social ritual of eating rather than hurried consumption. This speaks to relationship, to familiarity, to a lack of urgency or fear. These are the markers of ordinary family interaction, not criminal staging or coerced feeding. The forensic criminology perspective notes that the scene's casualness, items left out rather than cleaned up, the comfortable arrangement, the lingering presence of tea glass and serving spoon, suggests participants who expected to return or who left abruptly when something disrupted the ordinary moment. This doesn't read as staging designed to mislead investigation. It reads as an interrupted domestic activity, frozen in place when events spiraled beyond anyone's control or intention. We find ourselves contemplating the possibility that this pineapple moment was the last normal thing that happened that night. That what followed, the violence, the staging, the elaborate construction of alternative narratives, all emerged from whatever disrupted this ordinary scene of nighttime snacking. That the bowl and spoon and tea glass represent not evidence of criminal planning but artifacts of normalcy about to shatter irrevocably. Theme 3. The truth too heavy to acknowledge. The truth often hides in plain sight, embodied here by a bowl of fruit. This single, irrefutable forensic fact, the pineapple in JonBenét's digestive system, did more than create timeline confusion. It became the anchor point around which investigative certainty formed, the evidence that seemed to prove the family's accounts were unreliable, the contradiction that justified focusing exclusively inward rather than pursuing external leads with equal vigor. We must pause and examine this carefully because the pineapple's role in shaping the investigation reveals something profound about how evidence can be weaponized when divorced from context. How facts can be used to construct certainty while obscuring truth. The Boulder police seized upon the pineapple contradiction as proof of parental deception. If John and Patsy were lying about something as simple as whether their daughter ate a snack, what else were they lying about? The denial became evidence of consciousness of guilt. The inconsistency transformed into foundation for a theory of family involvement that would dominate the investigation for years. Yet if we step back and examine what the pineapple actually proves versus what it was used to imply, a different picture emerges. The pineapple proves JonBenét was awake during hours initially thought to be sleep time. It proves someone in the household was active, preparing food, serving it, or at minimum present while it was consumed. It proves the initial timeline offered by the parents was incomplete or incorrect. What it doesn't prove is criminal intent, deliberate deception designed to hide murder or family guilt in the child's death. Those are interpretations layered onto the fact, conclusions drawn from the contradiction rather than inherent in the evidence itself. From a psychological perspective informed by trauma research, we must consider alternative explanations for why the pineapple moment remained unacknowledged. Perhaps John and Patsy genuinely believed JonBenét was asleep because that's how they left her, unaware she later woke. Perhaps in the chaos and trauma of discovering her missing, the earlier snacking moment was forgotten, edited out by minds struggling to process overwhelming horror. Perhaps one parent knew about the pineapple while the other didn't, creating genuine uncertainty about household activities during crucial hours. Or perhaps, and this is where the evidence leads us most persistently, the pineapple moment involved someone else in the household whose wakefulness and activity during those hours couldn't be safely acknowledged without opening questions no one was prepared to answer. Burke's fingerprints on the bowl sit quietly in the forensic record, noted but rarely centered in analysis. a 9-year-old's prints alongside his mother's, on the bowl containing the fruit found in his sister's digestive system. Both parents insisted Burke was asleep, undisturbed by morning chaos, unhearing of screams that brought his father running. Yet physical evidence suggests he handled the bowl, was present for or participated in its preparation, had some role in this moment that officially never occurred. What would it mean if Burke was awake? If both children were downstairs during hours their parents believed them safely asleep? If something occurred during unsupervised sibling time that spiraled beyond anyone's control or understanding? The physiological research on childhood development reminds us that 9-year-olds' brains are profoundly different from adult brains. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, consequence prediction, emotional regulation, remains dramatically underdeveloped. Children this age can act impulsively during moments of frustration or dysregulation, causing harm that far exceeds their intent or comprehension. The gap between action and understanding can be vast. If something went catastrophically wrong during that pineapple moment or shortly after, a conflict that escalated, a physical interaction that caused unintended injury, an impulsive action with irreversible consequences, the psychological imperatives facing the family would be entirely different from those suggested by theories of parental rage or calculated staging. Parents confronting the reality that one child is gone and the other bears some responsibility, however unintended, face impossible choices. Protect the surviving child from legal consequences, social destruction, psychological annihilation, or cooperate fully with investigation knowing it could result in losing both children, one to death, one to the justice system and public hatred. The anthropological perspective examines how American culture in the 1990s viewed childhood innocence and juvenile responsibility. The idea that a 9-year-old could be involved in a sibling's death was nearly unthinkable, a violation of cultural scripts about protected childhood. This cultural resistance might have shaped both investigation, detectives reluctant to seriously pursue this possibility, and family response, parents unable to contemplate or acknowledge such a scenario. From a forensic psychology standpoint, if the pineapple moment marks the beginning of a chain of events that no one intended and no one can fully bear to acknowledge, the sustained denial makes tragic sense. It's not about hiding a snack. It's about protecting knowledge too terrible to speak, maintaining a barrier between what occurred and what can be consciously held, preserving the psychological survival of those who remain. We find ourselves contemplating whether the pineapple's real significance lies not in what it proves about that night, but in what the decades of denial reveal about the unbearable weight of certain truths. That some knowledge is so devastating it can never be safely acknowledged, that some events create psychological necessities that override every other consideration, including justice, that the gap between what forensic evidence shows and what human acknowledgement allows can remain unbridged across nearly 30 years of scrutiny. The bowl sits there still in the photographic record: glass, pineapple, oversized spoon, tea glass with its dangling bag. Ordinary objects that became extraordinary through the questions they raise and the answers they never receive. Simple domestic debris that whispers of complexity no explanation has successfully captured, of truths protected by silence, of the terrible choices that perhaps had to be made when ordinary life shattered beyond any possibility of reconstruction. 2. Dissecting the script. Contradictions in motive and method. Theme 1. The rage that couldn't have been. The police narrative, built largely upon behavioral observations and the pineapple contradiction, eventually crystallized around a core theory. Patsy Ramsey, exhausted and pushed beyond endurance by some childhood behavior, bedwetting emerged as the favored trigger, struck JonBenét in explosive rage, causing fatal head trauma. Realizing what she'd done, she then staged an elaborate kidnapping to cover the accidental death. possibly with John's help once he discovered what had occurred. This theory appeared to explain multiple puzzling elements. It accounted for the domestic staging using household materials. It explained the ransom note's length and theatrical quality as a mother's imaginative construction rather than actual criminal communication. It made sense of the fierce protection of family narrative over cooperation with investigation. It provided motive, method, and psychological coherence. Yet when we examine this theory against documented realities, Patsy's psychological state, the staging's actual characteristics, the timeline requirements, it begins fracturing under the weight of its own assumptions. John Ramsey's response to the bedwetting theory wasn't simple denial but contextualized refutation that forces us to consider whether investigators adequately understood the psychological landscape they were theorizing about. In his 1998 interview, he called the theory preposterous, but his reasoning deserves our attention. Patsy had survived stage 4 ovarian cancer, a diagnosis carrying roughly 17% 5-year survival rate. She had confronted her own mortality, undergone brutal treatment, emerged on the other side transformed. She described this experience as giving her profound gratitude for life, intense focus on maximizing time with her children, a recalibrated perspective where trivial frustrations simply didn't register with the same intensity they might have before her illness. Could someone who had fought so desperately to remain alive, who had stared death down and chosen to keep living specifically to be with her children, suddenly destroy one of those children over wet bed sheets? From a psychological perspective informed by research on post-traumatic growth, Patsy's description aligns with documented patterns. Studies published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress demonstrate that survivors of life-threatening illness often experience permanent shifts in what triggers stress responses. Tedeschi and Calhoun, 2004. The stress response system itself recalibrates. What once generated frustration or anger no longer does. Perspective has been fundamentally altered by the existential confrontation. Dr. Lawrence Calhoun, whose research established the framework for understanding post-traumatic growth, describes how surviving life-threatening illness creates what he terms existential recalibration. Values, priorities, stress triggers all reorganize around the new understanding of life's fragility and preciousness. Calhoun and Tedeschi, 2006. Minor frustrations that once loomed large shrink to insignificance. The daily irritations of parenting, spilled juice, forgotten homework, yes, even bedwetting, simply don't carry the emotional weight they might for someone who hasn't confronted mortality so directly. The physiological research supports this as well. Surviving severe illness creates what researchers call stress inoculation. The body's stress response system, having been pushed to extremes during the illness, actually becomes less reactive to everyday stressors afterward. Dienstbier, 1989. Someone who has endured chemotherapy, radiation, the daily terror of fighting cancer, develops higher thresholds for everyday frustration. We must sit with this. A woman who had survived what should have ended her, who described her continuing life as a gift specifically given to allow more time with her children, suddenly exploding in rage sufficient to cause fatal injury over a childhood behavior so common it's considered developmentally normal. The psychological logic strains against what trauma research tells us about how such experiences reshape human responses. Moreover, if we examine Patsy's documented relationship with JonBenét, the hours invested in pageant preparation, the travel together, the public presentations, the photographs showing genuine affection, we see a parent whose identity was deeply intertwined with this child's life and success. Whether we approve of child pageantry or not, it represented sustained engagement, active participation, investment of time and attention. This doesn't prove innocence. Attachment can be twisted, possessive, ultimately destructive. Parents heavily invested in children's achievements can explode when those children fail to meet expectations. But the bedwetting theory asks us to believe that a single instance of ordinary childhood behavior triggered such catastrophic rage in someone whose recent psychological history suggested unusual resilience and recalibrated stress response. And the theory simply doesn't fit the psychological profile it claims to explain. Theme 2. The staging that spoke of different minds. If we move beyond the supposed trigger to examine what actually occurred, the contradictions multiply. The bedwetting rage theory must account for what came after the initial injury, the staging, the construction, the elaborate transformation of the scene. And here, the theory encounters obstacles it cannot easily overcome. The discovery in the search warrant affidavit details JonBenét's body being found underneath a blanket, with her wrists tied above her head and a piece of tape covering her mouth. But John Ramsey's description adds nuance that the clinical language obscures. The blanket was wrapped around her, he said, as if somebody was tucking her in, like an Indian papoose. This wasn't hasty concealment, but careful arrangement, a presentation suggesting both violence and care, both restraint and tenderness. From a psychological perspective, we're observing staging that performs multiple contradictory emotional states simultaneously. The ligatures suggest violence, control, intent to harm or restrain. The blanket wrapping suggests protection, care, perhaps an inability to leave the child uncovered and exposed. The basement location suggests concealment, buying time before discovery. The positioning suggests someone who couldn't bear to abandon the body carelessly, but needed to arrange it in ways that created some psychological bearability. What kind of mind creates this particular combination? Someone in profound psychological conflict, experiencing competing impulses they cannot reconcile. Someone for whom the child was simultaneously threat requiring restraint and loved one requiring care. Someone whose actions speak to fragmentation, to operating from multiple psychological states that couldn't be integrated into coherent response. The garrote introduces another layer of complexity that the rage theory struggles to accommodate. The device was constructed from white cord and a wooden stick broken from a paintbrush found in Patsy's basement paint tray. The Wolf decision describes it as exhibiting sophisticated bondage devices designed to give control to the user, featuring intricate slip knots that required skill and knowledge to execute. John Ramsey stated neither he nor Patsy possessed such skills. The creation of this device wasn't simple panic response or hurried staging. It required time, specific knowledge, deliberate construction. Someone had to locate the cord, find the paintbrush, break it to create the handle, tie the knots with enough precision that they functioned as designed. From a forensic criminology perspective, garrote construction suggests several possibilities. Premeditation. Someone who planned this in advance and possessed the knowledge to create such a device. Research and implementation. Someone who looked up how to construct such implements, perhaps drawing on information from books or media. Or transferred knowledge. Someone who had encountered such devices before, either through personal experience or exposure to materials depicting them. None of these scenarios align well with explosive maternal rage over bedwetting. Rage incidents involve grabbing what's at hand, using immediate force, acting impulsively from overwhelmed emotional state. They don't typically involve pausing to research or construct specialized implements requiring specific knowledge and sustained effort. The timeline requirements create additional strain. If Patsy struck JonBenét around midnight or shortly after in sudden rage, she would then need to realize the severity of injury, shift from emotional flooding to strategic thinking, decide on elaborate staging rather than simpler alternatives, construct the garrote, apply the bindings, wrap the body, move it to the basement wine cellar, position it carefully, compose the 3-page ransom note including the practice attempt and clean up evidence. all while maintaining enough composure that she could perform these complex tasks and later present herself as freshly devastated parent discovering the kidnapping note. The psychological research on stress and cognitive functioning suggests this sequence exceeds what would be possible for someone in acute crisis. Extreme stress impairs executive function, makes complex planning difficult, reduces ability to think sequentially about multiple interconnected tasks. Yet the staging required sustained, multi-step strategic thinking over what must have been hours. We find ourselves confronting a scenario that doesn't cohere psychologically. Either the initial trigger was something other than sudden rage, something that allowed for more composed response, or the staging was created by someone other than the person who caused the initial injury. Someone whose psychological state differed enough to permit the sustained effort and strategic thinking the construction required. Theme 3. The note that tried too hard. The ransom note functions as perhaps the most analyzed piece of evidence in the case, scrutinized by handwriting experts, linguistic analysts, forensic psychologists, and investigative profilers. Yet for all this analysis, certain fundamental questions about its nature and purpose remain unresolved. The note's length, 2.5 pages, 376 words, immediately distinguishes it from genuine ransom communications. FBI profilers consulted on the case stated they had never encountered a legitimate kidnapping ransom note exceeding 1 page. The extended composition time required, estimates range from 20 to 30 minutes, represents extraordinary risk for someone supposedly committing a home invasion kidnapping. Yet the note exists, and its existence demands explanation. The ransom amount provides one of the note's most striking details. John Ramsey's 1998 interview confirmed that his exact net bonus of $118,000 mirrored the demand precisely. Not a round number like $100,000 or $150,000, but the specific figure that appeared on his recent bonus statement. Information that would be known to family and very close associates, but unlikely to be accessible to random external criminals. The note's language, as John Ramsey noted, contains bizarre theatrical elements. "Don't try to grow a brain, John," sounds like dialogue from action movies. The threats of decapitation are cinematic rather than criminal. The closing victory SBTC suggests someone creating mystery and depth, performing conspiracy rather than executing actual criminal enterprise. Most tellingly, the note explicitly ordered the parents not to contact police, threatening fatal consequences if they disobeyed. Yet Patsy immediately called 911. If the note's purpose was to delay police involvement, it failed within minutes of discovery. If its purpose was to create a kidnapping narrative, it succeeded only temporarily before JonBenét's body was found in the home, contradicting the note's entire premise. From a psychological perspective, the note reads as someone's idea of what criminals would write, drawn from cultural scripts about kidnapping rather than actual criminal experience. It performs menace while revealing unfamiliarity with real ransom protocols. It creates character and voice, the small foreign faction, while using distinctly American syntax and cultural references. The handwriting analysis adds another layer of complexity. Professional analysts examining Patsy's writing samples produced varied conclusions, but a pattern emerges. Not one expert could definitively eliminate her as the potential author. Chetubowski of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation found 24 similarities between Patsy's hand and the note. Other experts ranged from "probably did not write it" to "cannot be eliminated," with some noting specific letter formations and spacing patterns that matched her documented style. Yet experts outside the Boulder Police Department, those hired by the Ramsey defense team or working independently, often concluded Patsy was virtually eliminated as author. This divergence in expert opinion suggests the analysis wasn't definitive enough to prove authorship but couldn't exclude her sufficiently to remove suspicion. What troubles us about the note isn't whether we can prove who wrote it, but what its existence and characteristics reveal about the psychological state of its author. This document required time, sustained effort, multiple drafts, as evidenced by the practice page, and enough composure to maintain relatively consistent handwriting across nearly 400 words despite attempting disguise. Someone in genuine panic after accidentally causing a child's death typically doesn't pause to compose multi-page theatrical documents. They hide the body, perhaps create minimal staging suggesting intruder entry, and distance themselves from the scene. The note's elaborate nature suggests either premeditation, someone who planned this scenario in advance, or a psychological need so powerful it overrode practical considerations of time, risk, and plausibility. The sheer theatricality of the crime, the unusual sum, the cinematic dialogue, the custom-made weapon, suggests an individual operating under severe detachment from reality, or perhaps striving for a level of complex control that belies a sudden, explosive loss of temper. The note, the garrote, the careful body positioning, all speak to someone trying to construct a narrative, to shape how events would be understood, to control the investigation's direction before it could even begin. If the bedwetting rage theory were accurate, we'd expect minimal staging created in panic. Instead, we observe elaborate construction requiring sustained effort, specific knowledge, and strategic thinking about how physical evidence would be interpreted. The gap between the supposed trigger and the actual response grows wider the more carefully we examine what the staging actually required of its creator. We're left contemplating whether the investigation's early focus on the rage and staging theory prevented adequate consideration of scenarios that might better explain the evidence's actual characteristics. The sophistication suggesting knowledge or research, the psychological conflict visible in the staging's contradictory elements, the timeline suggesting either multiple participants or a single actor operating from psychological states more complex than simple panic over an accident. Third, the scientific vindication, DNA versus institutional inertia. Theme 1. The evidence that should have changed everything. The most devastating inconsistency in this long investigation lies not in contradictory statements or ambiguous behavioral observations, but in definitive scientific evidence pointing persistently away from the Ramsey family. Evidence initially disregarded or downplayed by investigators convinced of an internal crime. Evidence that even decades later struggles to overcome the weight of institutional certainty established in those first crucial hours. The Wolf decision, a legal document compiled after extensive review, noted the undisputed evidence of unidentified male DNA found under JonBenét's fingernails. This wasn't trace contamination or background noise. It was sufficient quantity and quality to generate a profile, a genetic signature belonging to someone who was not John Ramsey, not Patsy Ramsey, not Burke Ramsey. Not anyone whose DNA would be expected in that location on that child. DNA under fingernails typically arrives through scratching, through defensive wounds, through contact violent enough to transfer genetic material during struggle. The presence of unknown male DNA in this location should have immediately shifted investigative focus toward identifying this unknown male, toward understanding how his genetic material came to be deposited in a location suggesting struggle or resistance. But the investigation had already crystallized around family guilt. The DNA became, in the Boulder Police Department's analysis, an inconvenient anomaly to be explained away rather than a crucial lead to be pursued. Additional DNA analysis revealed unknown male DNA in JonBenét's underwear. Analysis suggested it was likely sourced from saliva rather than innocent transfer. Saliva in underwear is not easily explained by innocent contact or manufacturing contamination. It speaks to proximity, to intimate access, to presence during or around the time of the crime. The Wolf decision also documented a Caucasian pubic or auxiliary hair found on the blanket covering JonBenét's body, a hair that did not match any Ramsey family member. Hair evidence, while less definitive than DNA, still represents physical presence, biological material deposited during the time frame when the crime occurred. And finally, unexplained high-tech shoe prints were discovered imprinted in mold on the basement floor, near where JonBenét's body was found. These prints did not match any footwear owned by the Ramseys. Someone wearing high-tech brand shoes had been in that basement, had walked near the crime scene, had left impressions in biological material that dated their presence to the relevant time frame. Each piece of evidence individually suggests external presence. Collectively, they create a pattern that directly contradicts the theory of family-only involvement. Yet the Boulder Police Department, according to John Ramsey's accounts and supported by documentary evidence, resisted these findings rather than embracing them as investigative leads. From a forensic science perspective, the DNA evidence represents the most objective, least interpretable data in the entire case. Unlike behavioral observations that can be read multiple ways, unlike handwriting analysis that produces conflicting expert opinions, DNA either matches or doesn't match. The unknown male profile was definitive. This person was present, was in contact with the victim, left biological evidence in multiple locations suggesting sustained or violent contact. The psychological dimension asks us to examine what happens when institutional certainty confronts contradictory evidence. Cognitive science research on confirmation bias demonstrates that once people, investigators included, form strong beliefs, they unconsciously weight evidence supporting those beliefs more heavily than contradictory evidence. Nickerson, 1998. Evidence that fits is remembered and emphasized. Evidence that doesn't is dismissed, minimized, or explained away as contamination, coincidence, or investigative distraction. The Boulder police exhibited this pattern consistently. The ransom note's handwriting similarities to Patsy's, ambiguous at best, became proof of authorship. The pineapple contradiction became evidence of family lies. The behavioral observations became indicators of guilt. Meanwhile, the DNA that didn't match anyone in the family was treated as potentially meaningless, possibly contamination. Certainly not worth the investigative energy that the family guilt theory was receiving. From an anthropological lens, we can examine how institutional culture and departmental reputation created pressures that reinforced rather than challenged the early hypothesis. The Boulder Police Department, criticized for crime scene failures, for allowing contamination, for losing crucial early evidence, had strong incentives to believe family guilt. If an external intruder was responsible, then the departmental failures directly enabled that person's escape. But if family members were responsible, the investigative failures mattered less. These cases are notoriously difficult to prove even with perfect procedure. The institutional psychology created a feedback loop. Early hypothesis leads to confirming evidence being weighted more heavily, which strengthens the hypothesis, which further biases evidence interpretation, creating certainty where only probability should exist. Theme 2. The exoneration that came too late. In 2008, 12 years after JonBenét's death, Boulder County District Attorney Mary Lacey took an action that should have fundamentally altered the case's trajectory. She sent a letter to the Ramsey's attorney stating that new DNA testing had cleared the family of involvement in JonBenét's death. The media coverage presented this as exoneration, as vindication of the family's decades-long insistence on innocence, as scientific proof that the investigation had pursued the wrong theory for over a decade. Yet when we examine what the DNA evidence actually showed versus what the exoneration claimed it proved, complexity emerges that the simple narrative of vindication obscures. The 2008 testing utilized newer touch DNA technology capable of recovering minute genetic material from surfaces where traditional DNA collection would find nothing. This analysis recovered trace DNA from JonBenét's long johns, specifically near the waist area where someone grasping the clothing might leave genetic material through skin cell transfer. Crucially, this touch DNA profile matched the original unknown male DNA found in the victim's underwear years earlier. The match between these two separately recovered unknown male DNA samples suggested they came from the same source, indicating a single unknown male contributor had left genetic material in multiple locations on the victim's clothing. Mary Lacy's letter expressed deep regret for the years of public suspicion the Ramsey family had endured, and stated definitively that based on this DNA evidence, the family was not under any suspicion in the commission of this crime. The exoneration was absolute, the language was unequivocal, the conclusion was presented as scientifically certain. Yet DNA experts examining the findings noted significant limitations that the exoneration letter didn't adequately address. The amount of DNA recovered was extremely small. Trace quantities that Dr. Lawrence Kobylinski, a forensic DNA expert, explained could transfer through secondary contact rather than requiring direct involvement in the crime. Quoted in the Denver Post-Simpson 2008. Touch DNA is notoriously susceptible to innocent transfer. Humans shed skin cells constantly. These cells carrying our DNA transfer to surfaces we touch, to clothing we handle, to objects we're near. Once deposited, DNA can transfer again from one garment to another in a laundry basket, from a manufacturing worker's hands to clothing during production, from innocent contact hours or days before a crime to the eventual crime scene. The DNA on the long johns, while matching the DNA in the underwear, didn't definitively prove the donor's presence during the crime. It proved genetic material from an unknown male was present on 2 articles of the victim's clothing. But when, how, and under what circumstances that DNA was deposited remained unresolved questions. Moreover, the location of DNA, or its absence, doesn't necessarily indicate involvement or non-involvement. The absence of family DNA in certain locations doesn't prove family members weren't involved. It might simply mean they were careful, or that their DNA wasn't deposited in those specific locations while the unknown male's was, or that degradation affected different samples differently. From a forensic science perspective, the 2008 exoneration represented an overreach, stating certainty the evidence couldn't fully support. The DNA created reasonable doubt about family-only involvement. It suggested an unknown male had some contact with the victim's clothing, but it didn't definitively prove that male committed the crime, nor did it eliminate all possibility of family involvement in some capacity. Subsequent district attorneys inheriting the case quietly walked back the absolute language of Lacy's exoneration. They acknowledged the DNA evidence was important but didn't eliminate all suspects, didn't prove an intruder committed the crime, didn't close all investigative avenues pointing toward the family. The Boulder Daily Camera reported on the controversy following the exoneration, noting that many investigators felt the letter had been premature and had damaged the case by creating public perception of resolution when significant questions remained unanswered. Mitchell, 2008. The exoneration had political and public relations impact, but its scientific foundations were less solid than the definitive language suggested. We find ourselves contemplating the tragedy of both the initial tunnel vision and the overcorrected exoneration. The Boulder police's early certainty of family guilt caused them to minimize crucial DNA evidence. Mary Lacy's later certainty of family innocence caused her to overstate what the DNA evidence could definitively prove. Both certainties emerged from institutional pressures, political considerations, and perhaps genuine belief, but neither adequately served the goal of determining what actually occurred that night. Theme 3. The truth sealed in genetic code. Yet even acknowledging the complexities and limitations, we cannot escape the central fact. Unknown male DNA was found in multiple locations on the victim, in quantities and locations that demand explanation. This evidence doesn't exist in isolation. It appears alongside other indicators of possible external presence. The HITEC boot prints, the unidentified hair, the basement window evidence, the ransom note's characteristics suggesting someone unfamiliar with actual criminal procedures. None of these elements definitively proves an external perpetrator, but collectively they create a pattern that investigators convinced of family-only guilt had to explain away, minimize, or ignore to maintain their theory. John Ramsey's frustration with the investigation's handling of this evidence comes through clearly in documented statements. He recounted that early DNA results, which cleared the family, were kept secret from media and even from the district attorney's office for months. Because as he understood it, the results conflicted with their conclusion that we were the killers. In his 2019 interview with Dr. Oz, John described the police attitude as one of closed certainty. They believed the parents did it, case pretty much closed in their eyes. This institutional certainty, once established, became self-reinforcing. Evidence supporting the theory was embraced. Evidence contradicting it was minimized. The goal shifted from discovering truth to confirming hypothesis. The profound psychological cost of this institutional fixation resulted in delays and missed opportunities. According to John's accounts, the Boulder police initially refused outside help, keeping the FBI at arm's length, declining offers from experienced homicide investigators, operating as though acknowledging the need for assistance would be admitting their own inadequacy. The DNA evidence that should have redirected investigation toward identifying the unknown male instead became a battleground where investigators defended their original theory against scientific findings that didn't support it. Years that could have been spent pursuing genetic genealogy, expanding DNA databases, seeking matches through emerging technologies were instead spent in conflict over whether the DNA even mattered. From a forensic criminology perspective, this represents a catastrophic failure of investigative adaptability. Good investigation follows evidence wherever it leads, adjusting theories when new facts emerge that don't fit established frameworks. The Boulder police investigation, by multiple accounts, did the opposite. It established a theory early and then defended that theory against accumulating evidence suggesting it might be incomplete or wrong. The anthropological lens reveals how this failure reflects broader institutional patterns in American law enforcement. Departments invest enormous resources in high-profile cases. When early investigative decisions prove flawed, acknowledging those flaws requires admitting failure, accepting criticism, perhaps facing consequences. The institutional incentive becomes defending initial decisions rather than correcting course, protecting departmental reputation rather than serving justice. Yet the DNA remains. The unknown male profile sits in databases waiting for the match that could finally identify whose genetic material was found on JonBenét's clothing, under her fingernails, in locations suggesting proximity and contact during or near the time of her death. John Ramsey continues advocating for renewed testing, for transfer of evidence to more sophisticated laboratories, for application of genetic genealogy techniques that have solved decades-old cold cases. If they did, he stated in recent interviews, the case will be solved by DNA. Perhaps he's right. Perhaps the answer has always been there in genetic code, waiting for technology to advance enough to extract meaning from trace evidence, waiting for databases to expand enough to find the match, waiting for institutional certainty to soften enough to allow investigation to follow scientific leads rather than psychological theories. Or perhaps the truth is more complex than any single piece of evidence can capture. Perhaps the DNA belongs to someone who was present but not responsible, someone whose innocent contact became entangled with a crime they didn't commit. Perhaps family involvement and unknown male presence both occurred, creating a scenario more complicated than either the family guilt or intruder innocence theories can accommodate alone. The truth, sealed in genetic code, provides ultimate clarity in its existence even as it remains frustratingly ambiguous in its meaning. We know an unknown male's DNA was present. We don't know when, how, why, or whether his presence connects to the crime or represents tragic coincidence. We know the family cannot be definitively eliminated by DNA absence alone. We don't know whether their involvement, if any existed, was direct or protective, criminal, or desperately parental. What we can say with certainty is that the investigation's early fixation on family guilt to the exclusion of vigorously pursuing the unknown male DNA represents a failure born from cognitive bias, institutional pressure, and perhaps the very human tendency to trust psychological intuition over scientific evidence when the two come into conflict. The DNA waits still, in evidence storage and databases in the permanent genetic record of whoever left those biological traces. It waits for the technology, the attention, the investigative will to pursue it wherever it leads. It waits for institutional certainty to give way to genuine curiosity about truth rather than defense of established positions. And JonBenét waits too, in a grave in Georgia, for the resolution that has eluded every investigation, every theory, every certainty proclaimed and then quietly abandoned when evidence refused to cooperate with the narrative it was supposed to support. Conclusion: the architecture of uncertainty. We've walked through the evidence from every angle we can access: the pineapple that proved the timeline false, the staging that spoke of psychological conflict rather than simple rage, the DNA that pointed persistently outward even as investigation focused determinedly inward. We've examined psychological theories, forensic findings, institutional failures, and the terrible gap between what evidence shows and what human certainty claims to know. What emerges is not resolution, but deeper understanding of why resolution has proved so elusive. This case resists neat conclusion not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence itself fractures into patterns that support multiple interpretations. None completely satisfying, none entirely dismissible. The pineapple proves JonBenét was awake during hours initially claimed as sleep time. It proves family members handled the bowl. It proves the stated timeline cannot be accurate. But it doesn't prove who prepared the snack, who was present during consumption, or what occurred afterward that makes acknowledging this simple domestic moment impossible. The staging suggests psychological sophistication and sustained effort inconsistent with panic over an accident. It reveals knowledge of bondage techniques, access to household materials, and enough composure to construct elaborate scenes requiring time and focus. But it doesn't definitively prove premeditation versus desperate improvisation, external perpetration versus internal tragedy. The DNA proves unknown male genetic material was present on the victim in multiple locations. It creates reasonable doubt about family-only involvement. It demands explanation and investigation. But trace DNA in the modern forensic age doesn't automatically prove presence during crime versus innocent transfer, direct involvement versus coincidental contact. We're left standing in the space between knowing and understanding, between evidence and explanation, between the facts that cannot be changed, and the interpretations that continue shifting with each new examination. Patsy Ramsey died in 2006, never seeing resolution, never receiving the vindication she sought or the justice she claimed the evidence demanded. John Ramsey continues searching, advocating, believing that advancing technology will finally identify the unknown male DNA and close the case he insists should never have focused on his family. Perhaps he's right. Perhaps genetic genealogy will produce a match, identify a suspect, open new investigative avenues that lead to long-sought answers. Perhaps the truth has always been there in the DNA evidence that early investigation minimized in favor of psychological theories that felt more certain than science. Or perhaps the truth is more complex than any single theory accommodates. Perhaps multiple people bore different types of responsibility, some for actions, some for knowledge, some for the terrible choices made when ordinary life shattered beyond repair. Perhaps the DNA and the fingerprints and the staging all speak truly, but to different aspects of a scenario more complicated than family guilt or intruder innocence frameworks can capture. What we can say with certainty is that the investigation's early choices, the focus on behavioral observations over physical evidence, the resistance to DNA findings that contradicted established theory, the institutional pressures that made course correction feel like admission of failure, delayed justice and perhaps prevented the resolution that might have been possible if scientific evidence had been pursued as vigorously as psychological theories. The pineapple keeps its secret still, its presence in the autopsy record an immutable fact surrounded by decades of denial and explanation that never quite satisfy. The DNA waits in databases and evidence storage, holding answers if only we know the right questions to ask, if only we're willing to follow where science leads rather than where intuition suggests. And somewhere perhaps truth exists. Not in the competing certainties that have dominated this case. Not in the theories confidently proclaimed and then quietly abandoned. But in the uncomfortable space between what we can prove and what we can know. Between the evidence that whispers and the explanations that shout. Between the facts that remain and the understanding that continues to elude us. We search for truth knowing we may never find certainty, knowing that some questions resist resolution not because evidence is lacking, but because evidence speaks in languages we struggle to fully translate, pointing toward possibilities we find difficult to contemplate, demanding acknowledgments that certain truths may be too devastating to speak, even as science quietly insists they cannot be ignored. The house on 15th Street stands empty now. Sold long ago to families who have tried to build normal lives in rooms that witnessed something terrible. But the evidence remains, in forensic reports, in DNA databases, in photographs of pineapple bowls and ransom notes, in the permanent record of a case that changed how we think about crime scene preservation, media coverage of investigations, and the terrible gap between institutional certainty and scientific truth. JonBenét waits still for the resolution that has eluded every investigation, every theory, every certainty proclaimed. Perhaps one day the waiting will end. Until then, we stand with the evidence we have, acknowledging what it proves, admitting what it cannot prove, and holding in tension the possibility that truth might exist in spaces our frameworks have not yet learned to see.